Yeah, that's good. Okay.
So we ready?
Yeah.
Where are you going now?
I have no idea. It
Well,
just
we
goes.
kept running, so I'll have to edit
Okay.
that out.
Okay. Anyway,
All right.
so we saw each other. I think probably every night during that summer time period. We spent a lot of time together, and we enjoyed each other's company. And we were. It just seemed like it was a good thing. And to me, it was. As I look back, I think, how in the world did I ever meet her? And that worked out good. And I went with her back to Marquette numerous times, met her family, and she had an Uncle Ralph.
Uncle Ralph was a little bit on the ornery side.
Oh.
He had 5 older sisters.
Oh, yeah.
Terribly ornery.
Yeah.
Okay, we were sitting in Uncle Ralph's house. Uncle Ralph was entertaining and interviewing me in the front room. And they had kind of a window between the kitchen and the
Which
dining
is the door, through the doorways, the archways.
And her aunt and Carolyn were sitting there watching
We were
Ralph.
in the kitchen laughing.
Oh, they were just hilarious. And Ralph was putting me through the 9th degree.
Right.
And of course, he was ornery, and he had lots of funny things that he had. And
He was embarrassing John.
yes, he was.
John didn't know for sure how to respond.
And you were laughing, and I could see you laughing. And I thought, what am I doing here? But I ended up loving Ralph. He was a super guy. But it was interesting to go back and visit with all their family, and I liked them all, and they seemed to approve of me, I guess. But anyway, that was a good part. Well, now let's start into the farming side of it, because getting out of school, I needed to be doing something, and so my job, I was going to farm. Well, Dad's health wasn't real good, so I ended up doing all the farming, but I gave him half the income. And then we got married in '65.
On June the 12th, ever since then, because they had custom cutters at that time. So we could have June 12th as our wedding anniversary. But then he decided to buy his own combine, so we've never had time to celebrate our wedding anniversary since then.
Yeah, so I kept doing this, and pretty soon and at that time we were farming the Haas heirs, 7 quarters, and a quarter that I had rented from my Aunt Frances, my grandfather's sister. And Carolyn was teaching school. She taught school at Pawnee Rock. And that was a shock for her, because she had been teaching Commerce High School classes in Waukene, and she was going to teach 7th grade.
Self-contained.
Oh, yeah?
You know, all the classes in one room.
Wow.
And she had to spend the summer we got married.
Especially for the math.
Oh, she had to go to Hayes to study
Yeah, I had to get some
modern
classes.
math. Yeah, I don't know.
Not so modern now, but
No, but it was crazy, and I didn't understand it. But anyway, she did that, and so I farmed, and was not going anywhere, because Dad was just home. I was doing it all, and pretty soon I think it was 1967, I think, is when it happened. And I finally had enough, and I said, and I knew Dad couldn't farm. I mean, his health wouldn't allow him to farm. And I said, Dad, it's got to be you or me. I said, I can't do this way any longer. You've got to either retire and I take over the farm, or you take over the farm and I'll go find something else. And I really did look. I went back to Manhattan and talked to them, and they told me I ought to go back and get my master's. And I wasn't interested in leaving the farm, but I was putting the pressure on my dad to quit, and he needed to quit because he wasn't doing anything anyway. So he got mad at me one time, and I can remember these things, that he says, well, and that's the way he did, well, then I just quit. And I says, okay. And I took it at face value, and that was that. And I don't think he really meant that when he told me that, but it was over. And so then we had bought a house when he got married, a little house on 15th Street, 306 West 15th. Little 2-bedroom house. It was a nice little house. It was a nice house. No garage, but it was a nice house. And gave $9,000 for it. The payments a month were $50 a month. And but that was pretty good because I wasn't making a heck of a lot of money in
Farming.
And Carolyn was teaching school, and that helped an awful lot at that time period. And so I started farming. And the first extra piece of ground that I rented was an 80 for Mrs. Tallheim.
Oh, yeah.
And so then I had 5 quarters of a Haas heirs, my Aunt Frances's quarter, and an 8 lady that lived in Great Bend, an 80. And I farmed those. Of course, the tractors we had at that time period were LA case tractors, 50 horsepower, no cab, no radio, no air conditioning. You cranked them to get them started. You didn't have a starter, you cranked them to get them started. And our equipment was small in comparison to today. We had a 14-foot disc. I thought that was big. And a 14-foot Graham Hamey and drills. Spring tooth was 16 foot. I thought that was huge. And anyway, so we farmed and had cattle. And being married to Carolyn, that put me more involved with her stepfather, who ran the sale barn, who I started helping in the sale barn. And he'd say, well, John, here, he'd say, I got stuck with these cattle. You take these out to farm.
If you can take care of 25, you can take care of...
Yeah, he says, and so I'd end up with more, and Grandpa Bob, he figured that out. And, oh, he was a good guy. He was a humdinger. And that worked, and it worked. And so we kept building up our cattle herd. And that worked in that. And so we farmed and kept farming. And got into the 70s. And during that time period at the farm, I was involved with the Fort Hays State Experiment Station and doing some experimental stuff with them on no-till farming and that. I was the first one to start no-till farming in this area. And then we progressed. Of course, we used borrowed money for a lot of it, and we didn't have a lot of money, but we had each other. And we didn't start a family until we got married in 65, and we didn't start a family till 70. Charlie wasn't born until 1970. And that was, I thought we were in tall cotton, and
Kester came along in December of 73. They're really 4 years apart, but
3 years on the calendar.
3 years on the
One was
calendar.
born at the start of the year, and the other was born at the end of the year. Kista was born on the 30th of December at 11:35, damn near the almost New Year's Eve, And she was born, I think that was in a snowstorm, because I think the doctor had a hard time. And they were born in Larned. And boy, we were tickled. Had a little boy and a little girl, and we were, but we didn't. But in 71, we were still living on 15th Street. In 71, we bought the house we're in today, and when Charlie was just 1 year old, and so it was good. The house we bought, it cost $25,000. And there was not a tree in the yard.
No.
And the Christmas tree from the year before, it was a couple, we knew the couple, they had no kids. And their Christmas tree stayed decorated, was just put in the basement.
We've changed all that. We've cluttered everything down. '71 was a hard year. That's the year we lost my brother.
Yes,
And so that was.
that was tough.
Very, very difficult. And,
But
but we maintained a good relationship with his wife and their 2 children.
yeah, they had Eric and Chris.
Mm-hmm.
It was an untimely death. He was just 36 years old. And really, I hadn't really gotten to know him real well, unfortunately. And so, that's a tough thing to start in an early relationship, and your wife loses her brother, who was big in her life because Carolyn had lost her father when she was 9 years old.
9.
And so that was really a tough time. And of course, and I was trying to farm and learn the way through that, and I probably wasn't as supportive to Carolyn as I should have been, as I think back.
But we survived.
But we survived. Well, we must have. We're going to celebrate our 60th wedding anniversary this next summer. So it hasn't all been good. Anyway, so I'm going to go back to the farm. Well, we farmed the Haas heirs and that, and we went along with that for a long time, but I rented pastures wherever I could. However, it didn't make any difference how many acres. One pasture was down in Kiowa County, which was 45 minutes south of the Larned. And I'd rent pastures wherever I could. Had one on the river, and so as I rent pastures, Grandpa said, "Well, you need some cattle," and so he moved the cattle there, and they kind of worked, and then in the '70s, I formed a cattle company with my good friend Jack Dittman, Dittman and Haas Cattle Company, or Haas and Dittman Cattle Company, one or the other. But Jack had been in the service. He was a good friend. We did everything together in high school, inseparable. He was a year younger than I was. But he'd gone into the service, and he got into drinking pretty heavily. And when we got married, that it didn't work to a single guy and a married guy. That didn't work as close. He'd always come and see us about the middle of the night when he was drunk. That's when he'd appear at our. One time he drove in, he'd had a flat tire about Pawnee Rock, but he didn't change it, he just drove home on it.
Oh, no.
And he drove into our driveway. And
Sparks flying.
yeah, sparks flying, and you could trail him home because he dug into the pavement. And so we talked, and I said, "You need to go home, Jack." And he did. Well, anyway, I was foolish enough in the '70s sometime that we formed a cattle company, and because he had a farm, he was farming. And we bought cattle, and he was supposed to come out and help me feed in the morning. By the time he'd get there, I'd already have him fed. But we did that for several years. One year, it worked sometimes, but one year was not very good. And I don't remember what year it was particularly, but it was in the '70s. We bought 4-weight heifers in the fall, and our idea was to pasture them on wheat pasture and then sell them in the spring. Well, in the cattle business, it doesn't always work out that way, and so we took care of them all winter long. Had a few disease problems and a few hiccups here and there, but we survived the winter. But the market had gone south and had just deteriorated, and so we had worked to keep them alive and keep them through the winter, and they were worth less in the spring than they were in the fall when we bought them. So we said, okay, we'll put them on grass, and so we put them on grass, and the market kept going down, and we put more money into them. And so in August, it was time that they needed to either go to town or go to the feedlot. Well, they were still losing money, so we put them in the feedlot, commercial feedlot.
We wanted to say, lose a little more money.
Well, we didn't know that. But anyway, we put them in the commercial feedlot. And finally, I mean, the end comes because when they're fat in the commercial feedlot, they sell. And I came home that day after getting the check, and I says, well, honey, we could have gone around the world this winter and not scrimped on any savings, and we'd be further ahead than we are right now because we lost our ass. And we had.
Wow.
And, but that's to be expected in the cattle business, and so that was just a hiccup along the way that
My
caused.
mother always told us, she says, you are not in the cattle business until you have lost money
I
Is
remember.
that
in the
right?
cattle business. So
I
call
remember
it
her
that 'cause
saying
we are
that.
now in the cattle business.
In
so-
a big way.
in a
Yeah.
big way.
You know, so it kept progressing, and then I'm trying to think of when a farm really increased in size, but I don't think it was increasing in size until in the 80s. The 80s were not good years. I would borrow money, and the bank they were fine with that. Borrow money to put the crop in, and then you pay it off when you harvest it. Well, it didn't always have enough money to pay it off when you harvested, so you rolled it over into the next year. And finally, in 1984, December the 13th, these dates really stick because we were eating breakfast, Kista and Charlie and Carolyn and I got a phone call. It's about 7:30 in the morning before the kids went to school, and it was my banker, Kent Moffitt. And he says, John, and his voice was shaky. He says, John, I need to see you. We've got a problem. Well, I knew what it was. I tried to convince him, but he didn't accept it until then. So I went down to see him, and he says, well, John, we got a problem. And I says, well, how bad is it? And he told me, and I said, well, what do you want me to do? Well, I don't know. He said, you probably need to get some legal advice. And so Carolyn and I went down to see Phil Martin, our local attorney that we good friends. His brother and I were good friends. And I remember Phil saying, oh, John, Carolyn. He says, that's beyond what I can do. But when I was in the legislature, I knew this guy in Topeka, an attorney that is a bankruptcy attorney, Jan Hamilton. And he says, I want to. So he called him that morning, and this is amazing. He said he knew him in the legislature. Well, Jan wasn't in his office. Jan answered the phone. I think he was in the Ozarks or somewhere. And Phil told him what he had here, and he said, well, yeah, I'll see him. So we went to Topeka and visited with Jan, and Jan looked at us and says, well, I think the easy way to do is bankruptcy. And
I didn't want to do bankruptcy.
she said, no. He says, well, what are we going to do? And I says, well, that's why we're here. We need some help. And he said, well, you need to get me the records of what you got and so forth.
This was during the 80s that there was, well, interest rates.
Oh, it's 19%.
And, I mean, we weren't the only ones in
Oh, God, no.
problems. Our very good friends, the Youngs, they ended up selling out and moving to Texas. And it was just a common thing. And it
I
was
mean,
Yeah, I remember those days.
half of Roselle went broke. 5 banks in Rush County went under. Banks here
it
stayed.
was a bad time for agriculture.
It was bad. It was just terrible times. Nothing
One
was working.
decision we made was that we were not going to hide it from the kids. We brought them in and let them know what was going on. And because a lot of people tried to put on the happy face, you know, in front of their kids. But
Yeah.
and they understood that they would pep us up at times, you know. So it was good that they do.